Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and here we have our uh, what is expected to be the last Fine Print panel for 2025. I think the next one will most likely be beginning of 2026. Um, Happy to have the full panel here, Bruce, Dennis, and Ryan. So Ryan, like last week, it's if you can't be seen, at least you can be heard. So it's great to have everyone here. Uh, I almost always begin with my own introduction with my own kind of reasons rant. I should like to call it. But this week, to conclude the year, I would just like to have Bruce lead us off and. To conclude the year, Bruce, how would you like to conclude 2025 for the fine print?
Well, it's brought the country really to the abyss of oblivion as a republic and rule of law. I mean, we've witnessed taking this to a new level, vastly beyond anything that President Nixon did that justified his impeachment. I mean, just in the recent weeks, now we've become a pirate state. We are doing the same things that caused us to take up arms against the Barbary states twice. That caused us to decide in 1812 to go to war with Great Britain, interfering with neutral commerce. We are pirates. We just seize boats and oil, say we're going to keep it, and what's frightening is there's no limiting principle other than what we can get away with. We can intercept any commerce anytime we want it by having Mr. Trump say, well, in some way, indirect, direct, or otherwise, the money may get to our enemies. We don't know how much it is, but therefore they are aiding and abetting terrorism, and we're going to steal their property. I've never seen anything like this before, but it shows you that 100 years ago, when more than 100 years, we went to war against a country for doing exactly what we are doing today. And this is combined. Not only are we pirates, but we're murderers too. We go ahead and doesn't matter whether you're a civilian or not. If we say you're a drug trafficker, and that some of the money of that drug trafficking may make its way some way to Hezbollah, we're going to kill you, and that's it. There's no defenses, and it goes beyond that. Then you have the next element where President Trump says that 5 senators who accurately informed the American people and the military that there's a requirement in military law to disobey clearly illegal order, they deserve execution. I mean, this just goes beyond anything. Even Nero or Claudius or Caligula in the Roman Empire period. And then we have the last, the Friday violation of the what we might call the Epstein Files Act, where the Department of Justice anemically complied half-heartedly with the obligation to hand over to the Congress of the United States the Epstein files that are described with specificity in the statute, passed 427 to 1 in the House. Now, the good sign is that I've been working to try to get a congressional resolution that would find Pam Bondi in contempt. There isn't a good faith issue. That she didn't ask for more time. There are massive redactions, an entire 119 page of a grand jury indictment. They're insisting that they have absolute authority to decide on redactions or not, can't be reviewed. They say that the common law privileges that never apply to congressional investigations, they're going to apply in this case, like deliberative process privilege, which is going to include a whole lot of internal deliberations as to why Jeffrey Epstein was able to receive such leniency despite the notoriety of his crimes. So it's a sad ending of 2025. I can't paint something that looks like we're living in happy land when we're not. This and who knows? Maybe on the 25th, Trump will say it's not going to be Christmas Day anymore. It's going to be Trump Day. He's already renamed U.S. Peace Institute after himself, the Kennedy Center after himself. Maybe it's going to be George Washington Monument. Who knows? There isn't any limit to his megalomania and narcissism. So, and unfortunately, it forces us to confront, reality here. If we don't take risks and struggle to reclaim our rights, our unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence, they're going to be lost. And our posterity is going to execrate us, because even before we had to take the risk of signing our death warrants, like the signers of the Declaration of Independence, we did nothing and we're docile. So that's my opening statement. I regret that I have to say it, but it's rather to be truthful than to live with rose-colored glasses.
Dennis?
Everything that Bruce said can be footnoted. As someone who has served inside the government for a good part of my life, I look with horror at the jettisoning of not just law, but the legal principles behind the law. If you're in the House of Representatives, surrounding the rectangular chamber are a few dozen bas-reliefs of the great lawmakers of history. And that is somehow supposed to be a leitmotif, or to set the stage for the activities that happen inside that forum. It's all about the law. The law as a principle holds a society together. When people take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, that's not a pure rote. That actually is a commitment. And what we've seen here is a destructive undermining of the principle of law, and with that, the shattering of laws themselves, which really are the base of the social compact that we have as a nation. Now, this disintegration, which is occurring, will inevitably be felt economically by all Americans as the administration, unrestrained by Congress, pursues wars, sends money around the world in furtherance of wars or genocide, suspends trade agreements, imposes tariffs. People are beginning to feel a pinch right now, but it'll get worse because there's no adherence to law, and every appropriation that's made is made in furtherance of the law and the Constitution. So where are we headed? Well, I believe that as tough as things are right now, the system does have some resilience, and that the American people will begin to demonstrate in 2026 at the polls that they are not accepting the approach that the present administration has embarked upon. They do not agree with authoritarianism. They do not agree with with murder unincorporated. People are looking to live their lives, and they want to see others accorded that same privilege. 2026 will be the first move. And in 2028, I think we're building towards a watershed event in American history that is not only going to sweep out the kind of vulgar and vicious behavior that we've seen from the top, but will exact a certain amount of retribution on behalf of the laws that have been ignored and will continue to be ignored in the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, I think, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate, I agree with pretty much every single thing that was said, and I think it's important that, as always, that we tend to do, and I might have a slightly different opinion, but that we balance that with the reality that I'm of the mind that let's be clear, as always, Trump is definitely unique in his bombastic action and the way that he's clumsy about it. Like, on the face of what he's doing is corrupt and dishonest. But my mind, as always, is that historically it's been a gradual growing of that problem, and that whoever would have been put into this position, which is, what I think, would have ultimately been carrying out a similar plan. But I do agree with everything you're saying. And I think it has to be addressed toward Trump alone because he's the one doing this. And again, he is uniquely problematic right now. But what I want people to think about on top of everything we're discussing here and what you guys just said is where that seems to be going if this were to inevitably continue without any pushback like Dennis is talking about, which I believe we're watching a massive transition take place. I believe what we're seeing are these moves to drive us into a certain place that is either us calling for our own subjugation, our own transition into what they think is the solution to the problem they've created. Either way, I see this happening. I tend to see it as a sort of a globalist, Zionist, technocratic kind of transition, or effort. Now, people I'm sure disagree with that. However you see it, it's very clear that we're watching this massive change in the way, being told we should have CEO-run countries. We're watching this network state push happen. We're watching, everything sacred we've discussed is breaking down in front of us, I think, by design. So I think it's important that we look at what Bruce was saying and recognize how really dire the situation is. But as Dennis was saying, make sure we're aware that we are not lost in all of this. We have actions we can take. And I do believe that people, more than ever, are seeing this. And I'll end with that point to the open is that I've been bringing it up a lot, just some pushback here and there, rightly so, because we don't know for sure. But I think we can all acknowledge we've watched, even in particular around the Republican MAGA conversation, people start to call them their own team out. We're watching things on Turning Point USA having this massive division, like almost people are calling it civil war erupts among the, and it's real. You can see them calling each other out. It's happening on True Social. It's happening all across the board. I also see it in a larger two-party illusion awareness. I think that's a very positive thing. But yes, there's a lot of negativity happening as well. And I think that's because of that change. So I'm glad to be here again discussing this because I do think we can affect that change. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, just to build, if I could build upon what you said, Ryan, and I'm repeating, we need to underscore, as bad as Trump is, the problem doesn't go away with Trump. That is, we've built, a mentality and outlook that endows the executive with infinite power. And the successor to Trump, whoever that is not going to surrender it back unless Congress takes it back. He's not going to say, okay, I'm renouncing issuing an executive order. I'm not going to usurp the war power. I'm not going to usurp the power of the purse. I'm not going to frustrate your oversight power. And we have to keep that in mind. It is not just a personality problem. It is a political, cultural problem where the mindset and the psychology of Congress is, oh, the president does anything. As soon as we get our guy in there, then we'll get our road and we'll get our building and we'll get our defense contractor. No. We have to go to the root. It includes Trump, but it's not limited to Trump.
I think that what impedes our ability to solve a very difficult problem to solve is figuring out who is causing the problem. I think, Brian, when you say, whether it's globalist or Zionist or whoever it is, you want to attribute to people, trying to corrupt the system. And I see things very differently, and I think blaming groups for being responsible for our current circumstances, I think, is irrelevant to solving the problem. Okay, so I think the problem is the concentration of power. Okay, so we have to decentralize power.
I'd like to respond to that if you let me.
So talking about who might be responsible for this thing, at the end of the day, we should all, for anyone who thinks that they're against the concentration of power, should be advocating for its decentralization of power. So who to blame? And I also don't buy this argument. When you have governments that have the power and control you have, everyone wants to try and influence. The whole incentives are perverse when you have a government that chooses winners and losers. Whenever you have a government that chooses winners and losers, has a lot of money to do that, can convey perks and privileges to some group and punish other groups. Of course, everyone wants to be a winner in that, and nobody wants to be a loser. And everybody's incentivized to try and corrupt the system for their benefit. So there's a lot of competition in this game. It's a very competitive process.
Sure. Can I respond to that?
The problem is not saying Zionists are responsible for it, or globalists are.
I named 3 different things, but can I respond to that, please?
That doesn't do anything to help solve. I mean, unless the solution is going back to what Hitler did. Zionists are the problems, so let's exterminate all Zionists.
This is getting a little irrational. I'd like to respond if I could.
That doesn't help solve any problem. What helps solve the problem is this problem exists because power is centralized. We're not checking it. Every one of our founders had said our system would fail. It would be run by despots, okay, if we were not virtuous people, and that as Bruce repeats the quote from Madison over and over again, it's ambition checking ambition. Okay. Instead of we have a system where ambition reinforces ambition rather than checking ambition. So instead of having a check and balance, what we have is a system that actually reinforces it so that we have greater centralized power. We probably had an example just this weekend.
I'd like to respond to that, Jeffrey, please. Can I respond to that, please?
Let me finish, and then I'll finish. I'm just finishing up now. We have an example just, I think, done yesterday. From what I understand, I read this morning on the newspaper, 60 Minutes was going to have a segment on El Salvador and that prison that people were sent to.
CCOT,
Apparently, the Trump administration did not want to cooperate and be interviewed for the segment. So instead of what Mike Wallace would have done years ago, he would have had a segment where he said, "This is what we discovered. We checked and we double checked and we triple checked it. We went to the administration. We asked them these questions, and they don't want to answer them." Okay, that's what 60 Minutes used to do. Okay, and now it said, okay, well, the government doesn't want to participate, so let's drop the segment. Okay, because we don't want to upset the administration, because who knows what will happen if we change the administration. So I mean, this happens when power gets so centralized, and everybody knows the people who the person's in charge is an abuser of power. Everybody knows that. Okay, so that checks people's behavior. The people being checked are the people. Okay, knowing that they have a tyrannical, despotic person occupying the White House, who will convey many favors to his allies, people who support him, and then looks for any way possible to punish anyone who gets in his way. Okay, and that would, if we had decentralized power, okay, then his actions would be irrelevant. So go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you. So, I mean, I feel like the response was a little irrational to my point, because realistically, what we're talking about is the centralization of power, and obviously, it is important to know who is responsible for what we're talking about. And so my point, and you can feel free to disagree, is that it's objectively clear that we're watching a Zionist entity of power influence global events. And this has nothing to do with your reference to Nazis discussion. There's a very different conversation we're having today. I shouldn't say nothing, but the obvious reality is we're not talking about that conversation. So that point is used to deflect from that important reality of what's happening. But I'm also talking about globalism. I'm also talking about technocracy, all of which are intertwined. And that is an objectively obvious thing happening today. Now, whether that is what is responsible for the transition taking place, that's a different point. I believe it is. But to say that it's not important or irrelevant to point out who is the entities behind this, if we're saying the U.S. government's responsible, if we're saying Trump is carrying this out, and I were to say it's irrelevant who's doing it, we see the power being centralized, that would be the same response. I find that to be deflective, so I think it's important that we recognize the powers that are very much driving what we're dealing with. Now, like I said, people will disagree. We all have our own opinions, and I don't take offense to people disagreeing with me. But to act like it's just unfounded, I think is incorrect entirely. But that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think that just a second, Jeffrey, then I'll hand it over to you. But I think the larger issue that we have to confront, whether it's Trump or anyone else, is that when the government grows so big with limitless power, because separation is broken down, it means that everyone's livelihood, their destiny, their success depends substantially on the government. Then that's the formula for despotism. It's the formula for docility. It's the reason why 60 Minutes members and CBS formally settled what I consider an ultra frivolous case with Trump, so they could get a merger approved. So when you have the government so much into the nooks and crannies of everybody's life, they all kind of go along, to get along. And that means, and the public then no longer is a check. They become an enabler of the limitless power, which goes to the fact that we need to downsize government. Doesn't have to happen all at once, but we got to have a plan, to get government down to the bare necessities, not because they free market is perfect. It's not. But the cure is worse than the disease when you get the government involved, because as Dennis will testify, 99 times or more out of 100, the government acts with ulterior political motives, and the cure is going to be totally partisan motivated and end up in a disaster. This is what we see right now.
Well, government's not is not, nor has it ever been, a neutral entity. And I think the point that Ryan made needs to be explored a little bit more, because, having been inside the belly of that beast, there is no question that certain interest groups have captured the government's foreign policy apparatus, and that it has tremendous impact. If there would be no genocide in Palestine if that were not true, it wouldn't exist. And
I agree with that, Dennis. But do you think we would? You think if it was not for Zionists, we would have a balanced budget and we'd have no?
I didn't say that though. That wasn't my argument.
So we would not have a $38 trillion fiscal deficit. I guess that's a Zionist conspiracy.
Nobody's saying that, Jeffrey. Nobody's making that argument.
Would be
we don't need to create a straw man here.
Yeah, right.
Let me just say,
Zionist conspiracy.
Nobody's saying that, Jeffrey. That's not our argument. That's a straw man argument.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful here, not to extrapolate and be in danger of creating a straw manner.
And also, I'd like to just say one other thing, but I want to add one other data point. Dennis.
Things that are not made of straw. They're made of flesh and blood, and they have real impact institutionally. And I would submit that one of the core issues here is the fact that members of Congress and presidents can be bought and sold as if it were an auction. And these various interest groups who have been playing for decades, and interest groups vie for power, I've got that. But when they are on the ascendant and when they rule, the implications can be devastating for people anywhere in the world. So, it's not about blaming a certain group, but it is about addressing what is right in front of our face.
But I think, Dennis, that happens because Citizens United and money is so powerful. If you didn't have money involved, they wouldn't be able to be bought.
I agree.
It didn't, and that's a real problem. Is Citizens United and Buckley and Vallejo, spending and money is speech. Even really, it's more bribery than speech, right. And so the members become beholden. If you didn't have that amount of money, they'd be far more independent. I mean, you remember William Proxmire. I think he spent like $100, campaigning across Wisconsin, could win, and he obviously was very independent. Certainly more than anyone else. He had his Golden Fleece Awards. I think Lawton Childs walked across Florida as well. That doesn't happen anymore because you're talking about literally millions of dollars pouring into even congressional races. And that's an issue that has to be addressed, independently. But I say in some sense, I believe that the political campaign finance issue is a derivative of the fact that government's so big. That's, people look at return on investment. Okay, if I get access to a member of Congress and they can give me some competitive advantage or a moat, so I can then increase my profit margin, they do that rather than build a better mousetrap.
Let's hold on. Let me get to a core issue here. 51% of our discretionary spending goes for war, military, and related activities. That government is too big. Mm-hmm. That government is out of control. That government needs to be swept aside and in its place a security structure that protects us through housing for all, jobs for all, give people who are able to work, healthcare, education. We have become a fortress America, and inside the fort, things are falling apart.
Yeah, but I certainly agree with that. And all of it, I think it's even worse than that, than what you've described, Dennis, in the sense that that military industrial, I call security complex, it gravitates our genius. The Thomas Edisons go work for some defense contractor and get paid zillions of dollars. You know, instead of being Thomas Edison, have new electric light bulbs and everything else under the sun. So there's that non-quantitative measures that may even be more costly than the quantitative ones that you've described. It's completely out of control. Every place in the world, it's like the Roman Empire. Everything is a national security threat. If you read this national security strategy for 2025 that the Trump people published, you know, it's like Vanuatu, any place that moves, the Chinese could be there. So we have to go there, no matter how irrelevant and remote from our national security. I mean, the current effort to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela is another example. It's a 2-point. It's the Bay of Pigs 2.0. Nobody has one clue of why we're there and what's supposed to happen afterwards. We claim that all of Venezuelan oil they stole from us. You know, we stole it from them. You have to imagine that they actually thought the oil on their land belonged to them. No, we own everything in the world, and everybody is a squatter on our territory. I mean, I've never seen anything in terms of, you know, imperial mindset as where we are. And that costs the American people a staggering amount of money. As you're saying, 51%, maybe a bit higher. Discretionary funds, all doing what? Make us safer? No, to create conditions for blowback. I describe this as a foreign policy that searches the globe for a hornet's nest, smashes the hornet's nest open, and then complains, hey, they're trying to sting us. We need more trillions to defend against the hornets. Instead of, well, why didn't you just not blast the hornet's nest open in the first instance? But that's how crazed our foreign policy has become.
Yeah, I think going back to this is something that we all agree upon. We all agree on the fact is that we want to be a sovereign nation of sovereign people, not an empire. And so, and money corrupts politics. So these are the issues that we should focus in on, is really how money corrupts politics, and how we have to retreat from our role as global emperor. And then a lot of these other issues would go away. And Ryan, to your point, I sit back and say everything's captured. I'm going to give it a data point is Ukraine. Okay, initially Israel was neutral on the issue of Ukraine and didn't want to be on either side of that issue.
That's not true. I can prove that's not true. No, they've been funding the Azov movement long before this. Yeah, I can prove that. But their outward narrative.
The Israeli government has relied upon the goodwill of Russia. Okay, and the relationship with,
I'm sure that's what Israel's saying, but I don't think that's true.
Actually, Bibi Netanyahu in Trump's first term, and I don't want to make this all about Israel. Bibi Netanyahu in his first term, when Trump's first term, met with Putin more than he met with Trump.
Yeah, but these are outward statements.
And Russia has allowed Israel to go into Lebanon and into Syria, where Russia has its own interests, and this has all been negotiated on behalf of.
Yeah, there's a long-term relationship with Russia.
So the last thing Israel wanted, which is why it initially stayed neutral. It's also why the prime minister at the time went and tried to negotiate a deal. He went and tried to negotiate a deal. The Israeli prime minister at the time, did go and try and get a deal done between the two. And initially, when the U.S. had asked Israel to help sending materials to Ukraine, Israel refused.
Yes,
because
but look,
Israel did not want to
antagonize
Russia.
Actions are what matter. What is the outcome? It didn't happen, right? The outcome is that they've continued to support these groups. You can prove this. So they funded the Azov movement, different background. I can bring up an article from Times of Israel right now that says that they were petitioning them in 2014 to continue funding the Azov movement, and that there were groups within Israel going, "Why are you funding neo-Nazi groups?" The point is the outward. Look, I'm not in the mindset to take at face value the government that's committing a genocide and what they say about what they're doing in the world. But my opinion is that they clearly have worked with them. But look, the larger point is about I'm not even sure how that relates to the argument about why Zionism as a political organization, along with other things that are all the money interest point important, are influencing these events. I don't even know why that's debatable. It's about whether or not
Zionism is a political organization.
Yes, it's very easy to prove, Jeffrey. But we don't have to get into all this. It's look. The reality is the money is absolutely what's going on here, like they pointed out. And that's because these groups, and it's more than money. Obviously, we could talk about any number of intelligence apparatus type events, but the money is a large part of why these politicians are being manipulated. I think the stat I remember from a while ago was like 98% of the time, the person who spends the most money in election wins, right? And so say money out of politics, it's an old idea, but it's obviously a very important starting point. But today,
well, again, if money corrupts
government from the Israeli apparatus.
Ryan, if money corrupts,
finish my point though.
Again, identifying as Jews. Tell me what's the solution?
Jerry, are you really going to get into all this? I mean, look,
you're making this about Zionists.
I did not. I made it about globalism, technocracy, and Zionism as organizations influencing the change. You made it about Zionism.
So what's the solution? What are you proposing?
To what? The solution to what?
To these problems.
To the problems of foreign governments and
you're identifying. Well, Americans who believe in the state of Israel. What do you want to do with them? That they lobby on behalf of Israel. What do you want to do?
Nothing. What are you talking about? Where's this coming from? I don't want to. Americans can do what they want. They can lobby what they want. Anybody can. I'm not sure what you're asking. So I think you have a meaning behind your point. You don't think
any foreign. You think the only country that lobbies and who's successful in advancing their interests in the United States is Israel. There's no other country in the world.
I said no.
Lobbying the United States government to advance their interests.
I don't believe that. You didn't need to finish that. I do not believe that. I don't know where that came from.
Because you're identifying specifically Zionists, so I don't understand.
As what though? You're leaping into a completely different conversation. My point again is that Zionism as a political organization, alongside a lot of other things, are involved with all sorts of global events, influencing policy. That's a stated interest from the groups. Right? I don't know why that's debatable. You're trying to lurch this into a conversation about racism and Jews. There's overlap to these conversations, and if you really want to have this conversation,
so in global organizations. The only ones who are contributing to global organizations who are involved in international politics.
Probably no to your question. No,
there are no other groups. No other groups involved other than Zionists.
I didn't say that, Jeffrey. You're saying that.
But then why are you only naming Zionists?
I just named a bunch of things, and you pulling it back to one.
You mentioned globalists and Zionists. You didn't mention anyone else.
Technocracy. I mentioned globalism, and I mentioned Zionism. All three of which are objectively involved with what's going on. I don't know why that's debatable.
So the only ethnic group that's involved in this.
Zionism is not an ethnic group. Zionism is a political organization that was built around the idea of an authoritarian state. They aligned themselves with Nazi Germany before and after the final solution. This is all proven. You can look it up on Wikipedia. You can look it up on the UN documents. You look it up on all. The point is the group has hijacked the idea of Judaism if you want to have the conversation. And there's Jews around the world that are screaming about that today. Orthodox Jewish organizations in Israel, in the United States, in New York, and UK, screaming about how Zionism does not represent Jews. The point is that is an obvious conversation that's being had. You can disagree with that, but it's obvious that there's Jews around the world that recognize Zionism was something that simply took advantage. Herzl, in his own diary, wrote terrible things about Jewish people. The Zionist organization made it clear that they didn't want any of the Jews from Europe because they weren't good enough for them. This is all documented by the United Nations. On top of the fact that you can recognize that Ethiopian Jews in Israel today are treated like second-class citizens. They talk about it all the time. There's an obvious point to be made about how Zionism is a very different thing than Jewish people at large. But we didn't have to have this conversation because I made it about a much larger point. You keep trying to take it back to the one thing. So we can talk about it if you like.
I guess that the only political group that you want to identify are Zionists who happen to
Why did you just make the point?
How many members of this group are not Jewish? The Zionist group?
I didn't make it about Jewish people, Jeffrey. You did.
I'm asking you a question though. How many of these Zionists are non-Jewish?
There's tons of. There's atheist Jews in Israel that are very prominent. There's Christian Zionists all over the country. I mean, you don't know. I'd imagine you know these things. So I feel like you're trying to trap me here.
But I want to hear your definition.
I just said it, Jeffrey.
When you use the word Zionist, I want to hear you define it.
Zion. I mean, again, I literally just went through this. Jeffrey, can we please? You have an intention here, clearly, and it is not this is dishonest. I made it very clear my point. You feel like there's more point. There's not. I made it very clear.
I'm trying to understand you
all the time, especially when
I'm trying to understand how you define this Zionist political organization.
Zionism is a political.
Who's running this group and who are the members of this group? Who's funding it?
Jeffrey, look, this is getting borderline ridiculous. Okay, we can talk about the larger app. Look, there's a very clear structure around this. People anywhere in the world could decide to call themselves Zionists. To argue that this is dishonest what you're doing. I'm just going to be honest. Okay, this is not part of the conversation. You're trying to make point that you think I'm doing, and that is dishonest. I don't mean what you think I mean. I'm talking about the obvious
I don't know what you mean.
Zionism
That's the
separate from
problem. I
Jewish
don't know
people,
what you
and
mean.
you're trying to insinuate that
Brian,
I'm.
Brian, the problem is I don't know what you mean. So
Well, I'm pretty sure everybody else does because I've made it very clear.
Well, if I could interject here, trying to move it to a more general and productive level, I think that what is true, that it's hardly limited to Israel or Zionists. Other countries, MBS, Saudi Arabia.
Correct.
Just look on Farah's statements, right? Who's pouring in staggering amounts of money and hiring lobbyists to influence the people like Dennis, who are formerly was in the Congress of the United States. You know, look at Qatar, look at Kuwait, look at MBS, Saudi Arabia. You can kill one of our journalists, Mr. Khashoggi. But then if you agree to buy F-16 planes and support us otherwise and make a facade about the Abraham Accords, you know, you can do whatever you want. There are huge numbers of foreign lobbies. I say to anybody who wants to go on the Department of Justice Foreign Agents Registration Act can see that. And they pour in staggering amounts of money, you know, to warp and misshape U.S. foreign policy abroad. You can see that, I mean, right now, for example, with regard to why are we attacking Venezuela? Well, Marco Rubio thinks it's bad, and you know maybe Cuba. He likens Maduro to Castro, and then he can use Venezuela to attack Cuba and maybe return to Cuba that he wants. Anyway, this is a phenomenon that goes back again to the larger issue that the United States is an empire. You know, anybody gives us money, you want us to do X, okay, we'll go and be your mercenary and go fight the war for you because we control the world and do whatever we want to do. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And I think that is what, to my mind, is the more it's the summit of our concerns. We become completely lawless empire. That's no different than Alexander the Great or Napoleon or anyone else who was lawless. Mm-hmm. We didn't fight a revolution for that. We fought a revolution to get away from that. We didn't even want King George III. And we got to get back to why we exist as a nation, which certainly is not to imitate empires that were stupid and lawless in the past. That's not why we became a country.
Speaking of America, but then looking at it, let's first look globally. Wherever there are dead bodies as a result of state action, it's appropriate for us to ask questions as to how that comes to be. The death of the journalist Khashoggi at the hands of certain Saudi interests, that's a question that needs to be unspooled. Okay, we need to find out what's going on there. The deaths of so many Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of Ukraine and beginning in 2014, state-sponsored action to unspool it and to look at the ideology of it, to find out how did these things come to be. The deaths now of perhaps hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the land where Christ was born 2025, 26 years ago soon. We have the right to ask questions as to how does this come to be? How do we get into these circumstances? The deaths of Venezuelans, and none of these are equal in the sense of it does mean something if you have hundreds of thousands of people dying as opposed to one. But one person's death diminishes us all. We can hopefully agree on that. But I think that when we're looking at any action that results from state activities, possibly in connection with other states and by motion of other states, we have an obligation to go deeper into the inquiry, because it's not just about Trump. It's about something much deeper in the American experience here. It's about what is America's appropriate role in the world. We don't have clean hands, and it's easy to deflect to other people in other countries. I want to bring it back here to the United States and say, what are policies? What should our policies be? If we begin to cut this we want to limit government, and I'm all for limited government. Limit government by getting away from activities that result in the destruction of human beings all around the planet. Limit government by getting away from activities that take the bread out of the mouths of American families. Limit government by limiting government's ability to reach in and destroy people's own personal constitutional rights by grabbing them off the streets and throwing them in jail. So, you know, we're this last discussion that we're having of 2025 is inevitably going to be fraught with a lot of emotions, because we're all concerned about where the country is going and where are we going in the world, and what can we do to stop what we see as a movement towards a cliff that from which we aren't going to be able to return. So, you know, look, I'm glad to be part of these discussions, but I realize that that just in this exchange that we've had today, among friends, I might add, among people who actually love each other, we see this angst that drives us to almost distraction about where the heck we are as a country.
That was a trying to make point. That's why I don't think it's constructive to sit back and say who's responsible for it, because then groups that agree on solutions, when they don't agree on the cause, they end up not working together to find a solution. This is the problem. When you're more focused on figuring out who you want to blame than what we need to do about it, and what you can do about it, you could do without figuring out who specifically to blame. Okay, you know, is that
both are equally important.
One thing I always tried to do when I raised, you know, like my kids, I always said blame is bullshit. Okay, focusing on solving problems, not blaming. Once you get into the blame game, you're guaranteed to never solve a problem, because then people will argue over who's at fault. Okay, what people can do is they can converge upon, without agreeing on who's at fault and what the cause is. People can believe that there's a problem and there's a solution to that problem. And the more you focus it on who you want to blame than how to solve the problem, the less likely you'll ever solve a problem.
Well, it sure works well for the technocrats and globalists trying to take advantage, right? Accountability matters. You know, these people out there are breaking the law. But to be clear, I'm in no way suggesting, or I wasn't even getting to the point of saying that we're not responsible. I'm not trying to blame or shift responsibility. I'm just acknowledging an objective fact of involvement. I 100% agree with Dennis that this is something we need to address it here, which is what I've said every time. Right, this is about
like right now. If you want to talk about like the technology, okay. Right now we have Trump, and I've written a piece on this, you know, for one of the, I think one of our accounts on Twitter. And the fact is that you have this program that's going to be the private-public partnership between the government and the big tech companies, you know, and of course this is cronyism, and it's going to make a more centralized world of winners and losers, where a small group of high-tech companies will be in a privileged position with government to have access to everything about us.
Okay, but couldn't you make the same point right there regarding those people in the technocratic companies?
That's a terrible thing.
They're responsible, right? I mean, we shouldn't be blaming them. We should be focusing on the problem. I mean, that's the same kind of argument, because technocrats was part of what I said, right? So the technocratic groups that are in our government, I'm trying to make a point, Jeffrey. That's a very important reality. These technocratic groups are very much on the surface influencing policy, and it's not unique to this administration. So I'm just trying to make it clear my intention. The point was that those groups are responsible, and it's obvious we are also responsible as a people, so too is the government. But to ignore the fact that Palantir or any other group is, you know, personally involved with dictating and manipulating policy is not irrelevant. So too is when Zionism does it. So too is when globalists do it. That's the only point I was making. I just hope that's clear.
Yeah, I wanna underscore, I mean, a couple of things. One, I think the show, you know, how corrupt the system has become. You know, Truth Social now merges with a company involved in fusion energy. I mean, really? Why would they do that? Fusion. Well, it's because they figure, hey, if you have access to Trump, he can create a regulatory environment that makes you thrive. I mean, what does fusion energy have to do with Truth Social? I mean, nothing. That's obviously the reason why they merged. Hey, the government controls everything. This is another way of getting access to the White House. Now, this is the other. I also believe
this is what happens. This is what happens, Bruce, when you abandon really free market capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
When the government gets in the business, it doesn't make a difference if Palantir is the winner, Meta is the winner, whoever's the winner. Okay, that's irrelevant. What's relevant is the government needs to be out of this business.
Yes.
We got to focus on that. Whoever the winners are, yes, it's terrible that they're the winners, that they've corrupted the process. But ultimately, the problem is it's a corrupt process, and we gotta clean up a corrupt process.
Cool.
And we
Yeah,
got better arguments.
Jeffrey, we agree with that. But I just want to point out something, and this is the importance of paying attention to what Ryan's saying, because unless you name names, you cannot get a hook into the discussion. It just becomes ephemeral. It floats out there.
Which is what governments want.
The names anchor the discussion. The names anchor a process. The names give us an ability to try to, flesh out exactly what's going on. Now, to Jeffrey's point, you don't linger there.
Right.
You got to look broader at the process. You got to, but the names,
First, Dennis, I agree to you to a certain extent. The problem, if you can identify the specific entity or individual, okay,
Okay.
so you can. So if I can sit back and say Palantir in this company, okay, you go back to the Zionist, okay, as a group, okay.
The Israeli government, for example, Jeffrey. Israeli government. How about that? Israeli government.
How about Smotrich, Ben
I mean,
Gvir?
it's very clear. Thank you, Janice. It's very clear. I'm just trying to get pulled into the specific, because it's not relevant to what we're trying to focus on, but you can make it very specific. Netanyahu, for example, they're all Zionists. Or Ben Gvir and Smotrich, like your point, these are extremist people who are very dangerous, who have very clear influence over things. But back to the technocratic point, Palantir obviously does. And so those things are the same problem to me. To make it about, one of their religion, it's deflecting from the real issue. Now, there is an overlap to all of that, but it's so important to recognize that they are responsible. And if we don't, if we focus only on the problem, which I do agree is important, the problem is half the issue. But if we only focus on the problem, they get away with their crimes. And that's
how often, when you mention BB and his, how often do you mention MBS?
Often, quite often, actually.
Okay, well, if you would have said BB and MBS,
see, you thought you assumed that I wasn't mentioning him, and I am. You see, that's the kind of point that I'm getting at.
Yeah, but here you only mentioned Zionism.
I do not, Jeffrey. I do not. See, it's very clear that you have a tunnel vision on this point.
Ryan, here you only mentioned Zionism.
I do not. I literally just said technocrats, globalists, and Zionists in this conversation, but we've talked about any number of things on this podcast. You feel free to watch my content if you'd like to. I talk about a lot of things, including I've literally just mentioned Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, going back to the Yemen point. I'm much more broad in my conversation than you may think, but that's important to know before you assume my opinions.
Yeah, but let me throw in Jeffrey. I think we need positive things too. I say, what is the kind of courage that we need? Dennis says, right, we got to start at home. Okay, we got to have the courage. And I say, go look on your laptop at Tank Man. One person in China protesting Tiananmen, he laid down in front of a tank. Right, said fine. The tank was daunted, wouldn't run over him. Right. Now, and hopefully we would not have to take that kind of risk, but we need to celebrate the heroes who fought against what was thought to be impossible. Then I also think William Lloyd Garrison. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near where William Lloyd Garrison began his Liberator magazine. In 1833 said slavery is a covenant with hell, right? So, and he started a campaign for abolitionism in 1833. Initially, he was tarred and feathered, but he was around in 1865 when the anti-slavery amendment was ratified. So we need to show these things can happen. One can make a difference, but you got to have courage. It's what Aristotle said is the summit of virtues, because without it, nothing else is possible. So and we have to celebrate these heroes. Right now, we celebrate the armored knight. Everybody who's proficient at killing, we put on a pedestal, right? And don't worry, next year it's all going to be the warriors. That's what July 4th, 1776 will be about. It won't be about the thinkers. It won't be about Socrates who took the hemlock to emancipate the mind from arbitrariness and bondage. Nothing of that sort. We got to change that. We got to change our culture so we heroize, the tank mans and the Socrates and the people who fought so that we could have critical thinking, that we seek truth without ulterior motives, and we enable everyone to march to their own drummer, to develop their faculties, and that's the fulfillment, rather than this conception that somehow how many acres of the earth we dominate is our earmark of greatness, and how much money we have and whether we can build a ballroom shows that we're great or not. That's not what this country was about. We were different from any other country because at the time of 1776, all other countries celebrated kings, queens, squires, hierarchies, and everything like that. We said the heck with hierarchies. Everybody is equal dignity in the eyes of justice and liberty, and we let them all pursue and develop their faculties. We owe them all their dignity, and the purpose of government is to secure those opportunities, and with the rule of law, checks and balances, and government by the consent of the governed. We got to get back to that. We've migrated over into the empire system. Why the heck do we want to? We might as well revere King George III on next year, right? Why are we doing that? We fought a revolution to get rid of them.
Yeah, here I agree with Bruce, and I think here's an example. Okay, when we talk about the solution to our problems, we can all work together. As soon as we talk about who's to blame, now we're all arguing amongst ourselves. Okay, we'll never get anything done with that conversation. Never.
I don't see everybody else arguing.
Because we're all going to be arguing. Is it Meta, or is it Google, or is it Apple, or is it MPS, or is it Bibi Netanyahu, or is it Mr. G, or is it Putin?
No, see, this is
I think it's Putin.
This is ridiculous.
No, I think it's
This is
No, I
ridiculous.
think it's Bibi. I think it's this. No, I think it's all of them. Okay, what do you solve by having that conversation?
A lot of things, actually. But see, the difference is we all agree we can have an
Bruce
amicable conversation and recognize people can disagree without yelling at each other, right? We can go, okay,
Yeah, but then they're going to be.
maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe
Ryan,
you're wrong,
then
maybe
you're
you're missing
spending the time over who to blame rather than how to.
No,
solve
no,
the
I made one point. You can go, I disagree. We could move on. We could move on to the next topic and discuss that next.
Ryan, once you get into the blame game, you're now talking. Now you're arguing over who to blame.
Only
okay?
one is, right?
Instead of-
My
instead of
point is,
discussing
look,
how to
Jeffrey,
solve
look.
you're arguing over
I can
who to
say a
blame.
point. I can say I think this person's responsible. You can say I disagree, and I can say, okay, we can move on to talk about something else. That's how that could have gone. That's all I'm saying. So it's important to have different opinions. If this is about controlling and having one opinion, then I don't know what we're doing here.
Okay. I don't think it's having about one opinion. I think it's talking about how to solve the problems.
Okay, well, that's what I'm saying. I'm trying to solve the problem. You're telling me I shouldn't be talking about the people who are responsible.
Do you want to spend the time on who to blame?
I want to talk about what I think is important. And if you don't want that to be happening, then maybe we shouldn't be having this conversation.
So is the topic that's important to you is who should we blame?
Okay, this is ridiculous. I've talked about a lot of things. I've agreed with whatever. We've talked. The idea that you're about the blame game alone, when that's one point that I've made today, is overly frustrating.
Ryan,
I know. I just answered you, Jeffrey. Do you want me to say it again? My point is that you are focusing on the blame game. I made one point about people who are provably involved with what I'm discussing, and you won't let it go. And we've talked about a lot of things, and that was one thing I said. You can disagree with that. That's fine. I welcome disagreement. But the bull rush over the top to make me like this is the reason this conversation's got hard to have now is because of what you're doing in response to what I said. I'm okay being wrong. I'm okay having people disagree with me, but it's important. It's actually kind of crazy that you're arguing that we're not supposed to discuss who's responsible for the problems. Is that what your argument is?
As I said, Ryan, if you want to convert the conversation about who to blame, we can have that conversation.
Well, you don't have to answer it. That's fine. But I think I just made the point very clear.
I'm happy to have the conversation about who to blame. I prefer not to.
I know.
But I know I don't want to control the conversation. You brought up the topic of who to blame. Okay.
I didn't actually. I didn't. I referenced who I thought was responsible, and we could have moved on. But so I think the answer there was very clear. Let's move on to something else.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the positive side. I think we need to have the right heroes, the people who got to get medals of freedom. And they need to be inspired. This can be done. I think people have an idea that the world's too big for them. Their voice doesn't count. We got to get over that. everybody's voice counts. Maybe if it doesn't work in the short run, it's for posterity. Socrates wasn't able, he influenced posterity, but the Athenians still sentenced him to death. And we need that courage. I mean, mankind's made a crooked timber. Without leaders who are virtuous and are willing to take risks, we're going to go to the lowest common denominator. And the United States was made on a different principle. And let's make sure that the sacrifices of our ancestors was not in vain. And we got to recapture, their glory of liberty and the rule of law, as imperfect as it was. If we're going to maintain our own integrity, that's what we need to do. And that means everybody playing a role, not being a narcissist, not worrying about their ego being soothed, and do things because, in some sense, here we are in the United States in 2025. We're living in paradise compared to what was around in 1776, because people made sacrifices. They worked hard, and so we have to be grateful to that and make sure that we don't lose what we inherited and passed on to our posterity, what we enjoy. If we don't do anything, that's not going to happen. Posterity is going to inherit despotism.
Yes, I think the solution is in the design of the founders design. Is one is as Bruce talks about all the time. Between John Quincy Adams, that we don't look at monsters overseas. We didn't have a standing army. If we return to the principles of our founding principles, all these other conversations will become moot. Okay, because we would not be able. So that's why I like to focusing on getting us back to those founding principles. And I like to keep the conversation, in my opinion, okay, not imposing it. It's my opinion. I think that's the most constructive dialogue, is where do we want to go? Okay. To some extent, there's a whole bunch of other reasons that people can diagnose, okay, about how we got to this point. And if you ask 100 people, you might get 100 different explanations on how we got to where we are today. Okay. But we all agree, the four of us all agree, where we are today is not where we want to be. Okay. And we have a general consensus upon, where we want to be. We don't want to be an empire. Okay. We don't want to be spending half our budget in the military. We don't want to have troops all over the world. We don't want money corrupting politics. Okay. And we all want a much smaller government. We don't want a Fed corrupting money. We want to go back to a sound money system, the type of sound money system that the founders, designed. So we all agree on that. And so the question is what are the best arguments, in my opinion? Okay. And everybody's entitled to disagree with my opinion, is that we got to come up with the best arguments to convince more people, that where we are today is an affront to our founding principles, and that we should get back to our foundational principles, that we've now embellished, as we've sacrificed the soul and the integrity of a republic by being an empire, and they're not. And in order to survive as an empire, you have to kill the republic. Okay, so you can't sustain the republic as an empire. Every one of the founders knew that. Every one of the founders was conscious of that. Every one of the founders reminded us over and over and over again. They're concerned about the main role that they wanted to accomplish with government was to avoid despotism, was to avoid tyranny, was to avoid, as Madison pointed out, putting the decision of war into the hand of one person, so that we shouldn't have standing armies, because then it would not be likely that the government would be able to abuse a military that they don't have. No generation should pass on to debt to another generation, and that for over 100 years, we lived with a budget that was like 3% of GDP. So, and we didn't have this huge regulatory apparatus we had right now. So all the things that we can agree upon. And in fighting those issues, I can tell you there are a lot of groups. Every group that benefits from the current system, okay, will be against this agenda. Every group. So I think that's the reality of the circumstances.
As we wind up this discussion, because I'm going to have to go momentarily, I'm thinking of something that Lincoln said about mystic chords of memory, about connect us to something very deep in this American experience. And that has to do with this profound connection to and desire for freedom, personal human freedom. I think of this long train of people who are dedicated to advancing this idea of a republic. And I think of this incredible clash that's going on right now across the country, everywhere, over who are we as a country, where will we go, and I will say to each of you, my dear friends, we need to do everything we can right now at this time to hold fast to our friendships, to those things that unite us, so that we can look ahead to this next year and equip ourselves with all the strength and determination and the love that we have to try to make this country one that we will be proud to pass on to our children and our children's children. So with that, I want to wish each one of you a happy holiday season, the best new year, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to participate in this discussion. God bless all of you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dennis.
you.
Dennis, thank you.
It's another way of what Ben Franklin said: if we don't hang together, we all hang separately, right? That's, we paid attention to him, at least at the time of the founding.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think it's interesting that, it's an point that needs to be taken very, very, it's so, there's so many things happening that relates to right now, where I actually think one of the largest parts of this, and I mean, that's always what I think governments are doing, but, divide and conquer, trying to split us into different groups. And really the two-party illusion, the false binary in our political system, I think is the largest part of it. But there's so many other little under narratives and under divisions that are happening, like within the mainstream alternative media. And, so as long as we're fighting each other and we're yelling at each other, we're not focusing on what's really happening. Which is what you're always pointing out, Bruce, that we need to redirect and refocus, re-educate, understand what's really happening. But, I think that is a transitional thing that's happening right now. A lot of people are calling it out. I mean, on that point, I was curious if you guys do see that, I've also considered that part of that is, I don't know, an illusion for some reason, because that does happen too. But I'm seeing it grow in a really intensive way right now within the Republican movement. There's a lot of people for all we know, we probably all three disagree with their central political views, but are nonetheless calling out what the Trump team is doing right now. I just think that's an interesting little dynamic within all what we're talking about. I'm just curious if you guys see the same.
Well, it's constructive that they'll, speak truth to power, even if what we think their truth is a little bit misguided.
Well said. I agree with that.
And there is, it shows that they're not going to remain docile just because Trump says he's all things to all people, and he's going to get to heaven right away, and he surpasses George Washington as the best president of the United States. But in something, I think that we can't view this as an endpoint, in recapturing the republic from the empire. It's a process. It can always go back again, backsliding, and that's why it's so important to inculcate critical thinking. Always ask questions. Why before how. There are never any bad questions, only bad answers. That has to be restored, because otherwise, if we capture it one moment, it's going to backslide another. It's got to be part of our culture, who we are as a people. We ask questions, we obey the law, we celebrate process, we celebrate individual dignity and our greatness again. Everybody gets to march to their own drummer. What a wonderful, wonderful, great attribute a country has. Not how many guns we got, whether we can go to the moon or climb up Mount Everest or anything. Hey, we respect and do not disrespect any individual. Let them develop their character and their faculties, and that's wonderful. But I just want to make sure that we don't think that this is an endpoint. It's not. It's a process that's going to have to continue for a long, long time.
On that point, Bruce, interestingly, I think you'll appreciate this, Jeffrey. If you want, you can bring this up if you'd like. There's an event a tweet that was put out recently by Stephen Miller that has to do with jury nullification. And I found it real, and it kind of speaks to somewhat like you were saying, Bruce, about the, not respecting the individual, but also I guess like the kind of power of the people itself. But if you can bring it up if you'd like, the tweet's right there. Stephen Miller basically says another example of blatant jury nullification in a blue city. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So he's trying to convince people that the act, whether or not, let me just go to this itself. Here's his tweet. Basically, whether we agree with the intention or even the outcome, yeah, the attacking jury nullification as the problem, I think is really, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to undermine that power, which is like one of the only powers they still fear, it seems, like we've talked about more than once. I just thought that was relevant to what we've talked about before and, what he's trying to accomplish there. But it's very possible that the guy shouldn't be released, but it's the power of the people deciding to go, you know what, we don't care. We don't agree with what you're doing. I just find this to be such a powerful moment, and hopefully people talk about that more.
No, and just to build on your point, Ryan, one of the grievances against King George III in the Declaration of Independence was he's depriving us of a right to jury trial, right?
Right.
So Stephen Miller would say, oh, why? We don't like jury trials either, because they can nullify what the government wants to do. I mean, it's just an earmark of how upside down we've become. Instead of being ridiculed, and somebody should have said, hey, Stephen Miller, I guess, would you have voted against the Declaration of Independence because it condemned, depriving people of jury trial? And again, I can gain it to next year's the 250th anniversary. What are we going to celebrate? The epitaph on the Declaration of Independence? They become intellectually completely corrupted, and turn things upside down. This is George Orwell's 1984. The Department of War is the Department of Peace and vice versa. It's really, 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 really crazy.
They'll celebrate war. I mean, that's what they do every time now anyway. Every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day, it's just a celebration of war powers. And now Trump's even doing the North Korea style parades. It's just like exactly what you'd expect. Yeah. Pretty sad though.
Yeah. It goes back to the quip that Senator Lindsey Graham made after he'd been to Mar-a-Lago. He says, well, if you want to get a dress rehearsal for visiting North Korea, go to Mar-a-Lago. Trump comes into the room and everybody bows down and starts clapping.
Weird. Well, I'm actually gonna have to drop off too, guys. But I just want that. I figured, Jeffrey, you'd appreciate the jury nullification point. It's such an obviously important thing that I think Stephen Miller is just trying to, what I wrote is that I actually think he's deliberately trying to trick well-intentioned people into thinking that they're fighting an abuse of the government. Yeah. When in reality, it's the opposite. I just think that's so Orwellian in its own right. It's interesting. But thanks for the discussion, guys. And I look forward to the next one next year. So have a good Christmas. Have a good New Year's.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Okay, Bruce, it's just you and I now.
just the two of us. Yeah. Now we're down to a dialogue. Well, I don't, yes. I don't know whether there's
one comment was that I was being too argumentative. So I should say no, I haven't listened to Ryan's shows. So I watch some of the stuff, but I'm going to I am an argumentative person, and when anybody, I am who I am, and I'm not going to change. I don't try and be argumentative. I try and get people to define their terms with as much precision as possible, and I will still make the statement, even though I appreciate the comments and I appreciate the criticism. So I just want people who comment on know that I'm reading and I'm paying attention, and I'm answering honestly, and I am who I am. So I try and always be constructive. Not everyone always thinks I am, and that's okay too. So but that's why I tend to like, and I tell you, however, for those that are watching, and then I'll turn it back over to Bruce. I'm saying this is how I've been my whole life. Even when when I had the situation where when Parler was and I was involved in Parler, and the consequence of my opportunity loss for me, and Bruce was also involved in Parler. At the end of the day, I didn't spend time blaming anyone. It's not that I don't think anybody was responsible for it, and that there were bad actors involved. I do, but I just don't see the point of those conversations. I don't see how I solve anything by talking about, oh, this person did this, it's so terrible, these people are so terrible, these people are so terrible. No, I view my job is to always present the best arguments I have and try and do a better job at presenting winning arguments rather than losing arguments, because, usually there's a lot of people you can blame, but blaming people I don't think solves any problems. And so I'm not just this way because the issue of Zionism came up and I'm Jewish. No, this is how I've lived my life. I don't believe in spending time thinking on who I could blame and why I could blame and why they're the right person to blame. I don't find that personally a productive activity. People can disagree with me, and they have all the right in the world to disagree with me. But as a principle for me, okay, I don't find any benefit for blaming. I don't. So, no matter who is being blamed, I just think it distracts from coming up with solutions. And my life is about solving problems, not figuring out who to blame. So, in one part, to the extent that you're negotiating with people and you're doing deals with people, you want to try and avoid people who you think are toxic and would be bad partners. But it's not blaming them; you just try and stay away from them. So I just like to make the statement.
Well, Jeffrey, you have the support of Hamlet. Polonius, to thine own self be true, and it will be false to no man. So that's a defense of your character. I would say that from my perspective, where I really have looking and trying to focus on human nature, which is the same everywhere, whether you're in whatever your group you're in. Human nature is always the same. The motives, the narratives, and I believe they go whether you're black, white, whether you're a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist, they're a Hindu, they're all the same. So I fiercely resist the idea that any one particular group deserves mention more than another. They're all driven by the same motives, maybe different behavior based upon different circumstances. Because I say, mankind was made of crooked timber. We got to accept that. And the goal is constructively, how can we divide, separate power, which otherwise drives the world, so it diminishes the ability of any one person or faction, to oppress another. That's the goal. So I never say it's X group. I say the problem is mankind. It's not MBS, not Netanyahu. It's not North Korean Kim Jong-il or Putin or Xi or Trump. Hey, the real underlying problem is us.
If the American people got behind and said it's genocide in Israel, yeah. Bibi's a war criminal. If he comes to the United States, we want him arrested. If the American people came behind that, okay, we would not be sending anything to Bibi. Okay, so ultimately we're enabling people, and if people want to blame a few group of people, the question is we keep electing these people and sending them back to office. At the end, we go to the polls. Yeah. If we don't like the outcome, we go to the polls, and we should vote differently. Ultimately, it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to be smart enough, to have enough wisdom, to have enough education, to have enough curiosity, to choose well who represents us and the decisions that they make, and the limitations on what decisions they have a right to make on our behalf. And that's our job. Okay. And other people, it's like the work of Hannah Arendt, and how does totalitarianism exist? Totalitarianism exists because, people decide to enable, and Einstein said something similar, is that if you don't stop evil, you're enabling it. So it's our role to stop evil wherever we see it. And if we don't, we're enabling it.
Yeah, it's exactly right, Jeffrey. It isn't just, I'm not Pontius Pilate washing his hands and say it's not me. We have duties as human beings if we see injustice to try to defeat injustice. And we need to set an example of taking risks and spending time, fighting injustice. And in some sense, I think that we as citizens occupy, the highest office in the land, because sovereignty ultimately resides in us. It's not in the House or the Senate or the executive branch or the Supreme Court. The ultimate sovereignty is with us. And I believe that we all have a duty, in our own lives, by example, in urging constructive thinking, due process. Let's be fair about it. When it goes awry, we say this is a wrong thing to do. I'm going to vote against you, or we may write a book about it or speak. But in some sense, we're all preachers. We all have an ability to speak to others and say this is a wrong thing. We have to do the right thing, and not. We don't have to focus on a personality. If whoever happens to be there and you commit something wrong, you got to punish you. If somebody commits a crime, we don't punish the crime in the abstract, right? The person who commits the crime is the one who gets the punishment. So it has to have that personal dimension to it, but it's responsive to a larger intellectual, moral construct that says this is why we're doing it. This is wrong to treat people this way. We are not going to have this situation. And that's where I think everybody has a role to play. It's like having your time on Hyde Park. People may listen, they may not, but we shouldn't be silent in when we can see the injustice. I mean, in my own lifetime, probably yours too, Jeffrey. I'm probably older than you. You saw it with all those in the South who weren't necessarily bad people, but despite the racism and Jim Crow, they'd never speak up. So all the racists, ended up with the power. And if you were black and you tried to vote, you'd get lynched or your house would burn down and all sorts of horrible, horrible things happen. But that was because there was silence when there shouldn't have been silence. And there was very clear that this kind of racial discrimination was wrong. And we have to display it. We have different kind of wrongs today. And we just have to say, this is simply a wrong thing to do. I'm going to vote against that. And maybe even make people, if they, that they should be ashamed of themselves if they go acquiesce in this. I mean, that's how you get change. In some sense, it's the unwritten laws, the law of ostracism that you don't pay attention. You're telling me, Jeffrey, you come out with somebody who looks like a horrible business partner. You don't go shoot him or anything like that. We resist violence. You're not going to pay any attention to him. Go away. You can live as a hermit. We're not going to deal with you. And we have to have that social ostracism come back into play. So in some sense, it minimizes the need for more coercion, because most people, given the fact that men and women are gregarious, like to have some kind of social engagement. And if that's denied them, they may give their thoughts a second chance. But this is something that we need to be engaged in 365 days a year, even on Christmas. Okay. Magnanimity, wisdom, that's what it's about. It's not about giving gifts and this or that. It's the interactions we have with other human beings in a way that's virtuous, in a way that's not indulgent, but respects the dignity of everyone, and that common quest to emancipate the mind and, as best as we can, search and implement truth without ulterior motives.
And we even have the power to render money irrelevant for politics. There's a way if the people assert themselves.
Yeah.
If I'm a candidate and I raise a lot of money from the banks and farmer and stuff like that, all the people can say is, whoever's raising a lot of money from these people, we're not voting on, for. And if people realize, if I raise money from powerful groups, or if I raise money just from a few people, or if I raise money from people mostly outside the state, not the people over me, if I'm doing that, all this information is public. If I'm relying upon a lot of PAC ads and dark money and stuff like that, people could say is, if you're running a campaign that it's being bought by, these big powerful interest groups, we just not vote for any of them. Okay. And then the politicians will learn quickly and they'll stop taking money from these groups, because if they know it's a losing strategy to take money from these groups. The problem is, ultimately we have a system that was predicated upon us being enlightened, virtuous, and educated. So the failure is on us. It's not, we can figure out all these third parties, MBS, Zionists, things like that, but they can only get away with it because we're negligent in fulfilling our responsibilities. If we're not negligent in fulfilling our responsibilities, then there's other people can't get away with it. Okay, should be if we sit back, the problem is, like when some people say, I think like when Ryan mentioned, like, oh, maybe some people are seeing it. You see breaks in some of the the MAGA and the Trump group, but basically those breaks are just like over Epstein or things like that. There's no real great difference about. You don't hear anyone saying, I want the U.S. to retrench from the world. I want to bring all these troops home. Nobody's saying that. I want to cut the military budget in half. Nobody's saying that. Okay, so I want to pull out of NATO. Okay, I want to, I want to have free trade with the world. Okay, that's substantive changes. Standing back and saying we're unhappy with the Epstein files and a couple of other things. So we're now a little pissed off. The reality is, so far we only have one Republican who's kind of peeled off, which is MTG. We now have a bunch of people who don't want to run. I guess we got a lot of. It's kind of unusual for when you see so many people in the majority party that don't want to continue. They don't want to return to be members of the majority party. That's kind of a curious phenomena. And then we have the example of probably the only member of Congress who really takes the Constitution seriously, Thomas Massey, and he's under assault, by the whole party and the people. So I mean, this is more a reflection of us. As if we were virtuous people, people would sit back and say, I need to have Thomas Massey in Congress because he's the only member of Congress that will remind people of what their constitutional responsibilities are. He's the only conscience in the conscience, and you would think that more people, as imperfect as he or you or I or any of us are, okay, there's no one. If anyone did an objective study of saying, how likely would the founders think about something, and where Tommy Massey is on this, he clearly is the one closest to the foundational principles, and there's not a close second. I mean, right. So it's not as if there's a close second. There is no close second. So he's unique. So we should want somebody unique who's going to remind everybody else, okay, independent of whatever partisan differences you have, okay, we got to adhere to the Constitution. That the Constitution transcends partisanship. It can transcend tribalism. He's the only one in Congress who represents that perspective, okay? And American people don't want to preserve that. They don't want to preserve having a soul in the Congress, okay, to remind people of what Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, would think about what they're doing, okay? And to remind them that this was not what, as you both talk about all the time, is not what they fought the revolution about, okay? So that everything is antithetical and is actually a repudiation of our foundational principles. So
one of the things to re-emphasize what you said, and this is James Madison, these are his precise words about, he says, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. Okay? So he's telling you, if you want to be your own governors, you got to know stuff. You got to think. You got to absorb information. You have to have an interest in the community. Otherwise, you're not going to be your own governors. And that's one of the reasons why in George Washington's very first State of the Union message, he underscored the urgency of education. He said, we need public education because that's going to imprint on our ultimate laws and philosophy of adjudication. And unfortunately, our educational system is in decay. I mean, it is so ridiculously bad. They don't graduate people from high school or college who could pass the immigration test to become naturalized. We have members of Congress who don't even know their three branches of government. So we have to get back, and a part of it, but remember education as well. And I think
members of the Supreme Court who don't know that either.
Yeah, Supreme Court doesn't know it either. But I think Jeffrey and I were the same, where we learned everything outside the classroom rather than inside the classroom, right? So this is dull inside the classroom. I got to read stimulating stuff, Areopagitica, John Milton, the Federalist Papers, Voltaire, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. That's where he got wisdom. And that's why I believe it's very important that the culture gives signals. Hey, school is important, but learning is 24 hours a day. You don't turn your brain off because your brain in part keeps you attuned to virtue, to courage, to justice, which can happen at any point in your life. But it can happen. And you know what? This cure, which is a psychological cure, it's cost-free. You just need to change your behavior. Doesn't cost you anything, right? Doesn't come out of your paycheck, no tax. So this is really what we have to recognize is it's not going to happen overnight, by any means. It has to start someplace. And to say, if not us, who? If not now, when? Schopenhauer used to say the first time a new idea comes along, everyone says, oh, it's ridiculously, you must be hallucinating. The second time, they kind of smile at it. And the third time they say, well, it's obvious that it was true from the outset. That's how the mind works. They come up with a new idea. You think the first time, Copernicus and Galileo said, you know what, the earth is not the center of the universe, they ever said, just stood up, clap? No, it took a really, really long time, many years before people, oh, maybe that is true. Something as clear as that. And so we just have to be patient that even if we change our attitudes, it's still good. We got to be patient. It's got to be a while before we are able to see tangible differences, but somebody has to do it. That's how all change for the better occurs.
And as I like to remind people, when we have a discussion of ideas, the author of ideas should be independent of the ideas being expressed. And I think a great reminder of that is that the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers were all written with pseudonyms.
Yeah.
So it was not James Madison saying, "Look how smart I am. Why don't you read my Federalist paper?" It's John Jay wrote his and Hamilton wrote his. But it was a matter of people saying, we want to debate the ideas behind the Constitution. And so who's the author is irrelevant to the content itself. Okay. And we're a society today that basically our first priority is who wrote it, and then we'll make a decision who to read it, and so then everybody ends up reading the same authors because there seems to be consensus about this is the consensus opinions, because people want to read somebody whose name they know, they become familiar with, or whatever that type of criteria, so we don't really know how much good content we're missing out on because we're more interested in who the author is than the content itself. So, and if we had one person say something and a different person say the exact same thing, the response will be different just based upon who the author was, independent of the content. So I think, I've seen this done a number of times where some people have gone and said they took a quote, like they went to a bunch of Republicans and they took quotes from Obama and get the quotes, and they say, I like that. And then as soon as they heard Obama said it, then they changed their mind about locking it. And then they did the same thing with Democrats and taking quotes from like Bush or something like that, where they took some of his things that Democrats said, I like that. And then when they heard Bush said it, then they changed their mind. So when all they were evaluating the content, okay, they had a different opinion than once they discovered who the author was. So they paid more attention to who the author was than to what the content said. I think that's a depiction of our society today. Okay, is that we don't really care much for content. So if somebody says something we like, whatever they say, we're fine with. Okay, we don't even think much about it.
Jeffrey, one anecdote I think that illustrates your point in a rather humorous way. Dick Cheney, when he was vice president, he said that he was going to go campaign for a Democrat in Washington State and made sure the Democrat lose, because anybody who thought that Dick Cheney was for him must be a bad guy. That's how he's going to sink the chances of all his opponents. But it illustrates your point that people just focus on the personality and not the substance. It's all, it's very, very disheartening.
Yeah. That's why one of the things that also has always appealed to me about, when people want to talk about, Bitcoin. Bitcoin, we have a pseudonymous lawyer. We don't author. We don't know who wrote it. People have done investigations and tried to come up with theories behind it, but we've not been able to prove who the author is. And if we did prove who the author was, we'd spend all our time talking about the author and maybe what biases in their life, and then we'd start criticizing Bitcoin, not because of any of its attributes, but because of the author and the author's potential biases. And so then Bitcoin becomes a reflection of the authors. But we kind of know what the author's biases are. We already know what the author's biases are by the writing. We know the author's bias is against centralization, and for decentralization. And that's all we really need to know. If people want to talk about criticizing Bitcoin, at least now the criticism is focused just on the content of the article itself, as opposed to what's wrong with the author, and let's destroy the concept because we'll destroy the author, and by destroying the author, then we'll make sure that the content will be destroyed as a consequence of destroying the author. And it's easy to destroy a person than it is an idea. Okay, destroying an idea requires a lot more effort than destroying an individual, which is much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, I don't know whether exhausted things, Jeffrey. I want to go out of my way. I have to get on to another Zoom. But this is, I really believe that that we do, that the most important thing that we can convey to our audience is that we are the ultimate issue. There are a lot of reasons that we can string together as to why we're in a plight, but it all stems back to us. We've met the enemy and we are they. Enemy not in a bad sense, but we just got to recognize that we can change things, our own behavior, our own attitude. Don't feel helpless. Don't feel that you're just a little small cog in a big machine. Everybody in Washington, they pull their britches on and they have the same hairdos as everybody else does. Don't feel that they're omnipotent and wiser than anyone else. Look at what they say on the merits, not as Jeffrey's saying, look at their personality, that the title they have. When they get a title, they don't suddenly have a rush of brain power going into their cranium. They end up with power, but doesn't necessarily correspond to their wisdom. And the last thing is, as Jeffrey points out, we got to think about, be forward looking. Fault finding never gets you anywhere, right? You can look at it to try to find solutions, but let's always look forward and let's never disrespect each other. We can disagree with ideas, but we're all individuals, and we all have the same dignity at birth. And if we work together as human beings, we can make the world a little better place. We're not going to make it perfect because mankind's not made of perfect timber. But that's the spirit which we should live, not bitterness. And let's just stand up. And we shouldn't complain either. I'm always against complaining. I would tell my kids, unless we're worse off than a baby born in the Sahel with no milk or water, let's just deal with it. Life can be unfair because we aren't born in the same circumstances as somebody could win a Powerball contest or something. But hey, let's just deal with the things that we can control. And that's what makes life virtuous and rewarding. And you can make it rewarding and virtuous every day of the year by acting according to those principles.
Thank you. I will just strongly agree with everything you said, especially the points about the fact is that we are the owners of our own actions, and that's what we should focus on, what we're responsible for and what we have control over. And we should not focus much on what we have no control over and little influence over. We just do what we can. And yeah, I strongly believe that that blaming and whining are for losers. So I think winners focus on how to succeed. Losers come up with excuses on why things are not the way they want them to be. So that might sound harsh, but it's what I believe, and everybody should feel empowered, and nobody should feel they're a victim of anybody else. So life isn't just shit happens that you can't control. Deal with it and focus on what you can control. And most people are able to make a pretty decent life on what they control, even if there's stuff that comes along the way that are unjust, that are unfair, they're not right, but that's life. So and those are things you have little influence over. So don't spend too much time thinking about the things you have little to no influence on when you can spending your time thinking about the things you have influence over. So thank you.
We'll have it. The new year will be 2026, and let's make it the best that we can. If we move we gotta, like I said, we don't expect that the best that we can do. It's not going to change, the species overnight. Nothing can. But don't be disappointed by incrementalism. Go back and think about William Lloyd Garrison. It was 32 years of living in the outliers, and anti-slavery amendment was ratified, right? Look at the women's suffrage amendment, 1848, Seneca Falls, 1919, the 19th Amendment. So sometimes it comes faster or slower, but the point is we're resilient, we're buoyant every day. It comes earlier or later. It's not going to change our attitude and our efforts. It always remains constant, like the North Star.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Okay. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day and
You
have
too.
wonderful holidays. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Same to you. Bye.